Good day, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm the director of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, and welcome to the Global China Research Colloquium. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to invite you to the last session of the colloquium this semester, or in 2021. That'll be on Wednesday, December 15th. It's called Banking on Beijing, the Aims and Impacts of Chinese Overseas Development Program. And that's with Austin Strange, and he'll be sharing a synthesis of a new and exciting book that him and colleagues have put together and is just about to be released. Today we have Yangsiyu Lu. If you've been following the academic research on China's Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese overseas development in general, it's pretty well established now that there are significant potential benefits of Chinese overseas economic activity, and that much of it has already come into fruition. The landmark study called Belt Road Economics by the World Bank showed that the economic potential of the Belt Road, when it's fully implemented, could have upwards of 3% of GDP impacts increase for participating countries. To put that into context, that's almost 3 times larger than the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Recent research by Austin Strange and some of his colleagues, actually, who will be here next week, that's recently been published in the American Economic Journal, shows that some of those benefits are already coming to fruition. In an econometric analysis for the first few years of Chinese overseas development finance, these folks show that there's a positive and statistically significant relationship between Chinese overseas development finance projects and average levels of income. But in addition to these benefits, there's also risks. And the key for participating countries in China itself is to try to maximize those benefits and minimize those risks. Today, Yangsiyu Lu will be presenting her paper that examines some of the environmental risks that are part of the Belt Road and overseas development finance, not just for China. These kinds of risks happen for large projects around the world, but today she'll be focusing on China. This is a paper in progress called Environmental Risks in Power Plant Suspension. Yangsiyu is a pre-doctoral fellow here at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, and she's currently pursuing a PhD at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment and the Institute of New Economic Thinking at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on evaluating the impact of environmental policy on firms and driving technological innovation in energy transitions. Before starting at Oxford, she had a master's degree in environmental management. I can't speak French, so I'll destroy that. But we're really excited to have her as a fellow here at the GDP Center. Welcome all of you again. Yangsiyu will present her work for around a half hour, and then we'll have a global discussion, and look forward to hear from all of you on your comments and questions. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom, you'll notice a Q&A button. So when you have questions for Yangsiyu, click into that, tell us your name and your affiliation, and then put in a short question. I'll ask Yangsiyu clusters of these after her presentation. Thanks so much, and take it away, Yangsiyu.
Thanks, Kevin, for your very kind introduction. I'll just share the screen first. So yeah, I think you should be able to see the screen for now. So just let me know if it is not showing properly. Cool. Okay, thanks. So yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. The work I'm going to present is a joint work with my colleagues from Oxford and the GDP Center, as you could see here. And in this paper, we are going to examine Chinese overseas investments in power plants, and we pay particular attention to those that have been suspended. So I'll start with some background. Energy investment is crucial for achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Targets. As of 2020, there's still 10% of the global population that do not have access to electricity. And as we all know, there is the urgency of combating climate change, and the electricity sector is at pressing needs to be decarbonized. China has become one of the largest energy financiers over the past several years. To give you an idea of the scale, two Chinese policy banks have provided more than 200 billion US dollars energy finance to more than 80 countries since 2000. However, not all of these investments are assured. According to a report earlier this year, there were around 65 billion US dollars of Chinese-backed coal power plants that have been shelved or canceled, and more projects have been delayed. A very prominent example of this is the 6.6 gigawatt Hammerwen coal plant in Egypt, which was indefinitely postponed last year. If this power plant was built, it would be the world's second largest coal-fired power plant. So all of these motivate us to explore the risks behind these power project suspensions. Environmental issues have been at the heart of the discussion on power plant investments because of their impacts on the environment. And concerns were mainly driven by increased carbon emissions from fossil fuel power plants, environmental quality degradation, such as air pollution, and also biodiversity loss. So we had a look at the literature, and we find there is large attention on these projects' potential environmental impacts, but there is very limited knowledge on whether these projects are successfully commissioned. Also, there has been a wide range of ex-ante studies that identify many different kinds of investment risks, but there lacks evidence-based research that quantifies the impact of these risks on project implementation. So in this paper, we are going to narrow down these research gaps by studying Chinese firms' overseas investments in power plants. So we trace the status of Chinese firms' overseas investments in power plants, and we compare the differences in location, firm ownership, and technology between the suspended and progressed ones. And we examine the environmental risks underlying the suspended projects. So here, just to highlight that in this paper, we focus on Chinese firms' overseas investments, so which may or may not involve financing from Chinese policy banks. Okay, so then I'll just spend the next few minutes to give a brief overview of the data and methods we used. So we collect the power generation unit data from the following three sources. So the World Electric Power Plants database is a database that that covers the global power plants at the generation unit level. And we complement this source with two other sources that provide the geolocation of these power units. And then we collect information of Chinese firms' overseas investments, firstly from China's Global Power Database, so which is a database that we maintain here at the GDP Center. And then so in this database, we use those power projects that are involved with foreign direct investments. And then we also complement this data source with two other sources from Bloomberg's Merger and Acquisition Deal database, and also the China Global Investment Tracker. So these are where our data are from to construct the Chinese firms' overseas investments. And then in order to test whether these risks are linked with the power project suspension, we use survival analysis. So the advantage of survival analysis is it not considers not only whether the power unit was suspended, but also the length of time it took for the suspension to occur. So we organize our data in the project year format, and we include observations of power unit from its investment year till the suspension year, or 2020, for those that have not been suspended. And then we apply a parametric regression model. As you could see here, the dependent variable is the hazard rate, is a hazard at time t, and the hazard rate of risk variables are given by the exponent of their coefficient beta. So I will not go into detail here, but just one thing for you to remember is we will report the hazard ratios of the risk variables in our results tables. And in order to interpret the hazard ratio, when it is bigger than 1, it signals an increased risk of failure, and vice versa. Okay, so then I'll show you the results. So firstly, we map Chinese firms' overseas power projects. We do the mapping first. Overall, we have constructed a data set of 1,393 power units that were invested by Chinese firms between 1997 and 2020. And as you can see here, they were spanning across 78 countries. And then we identified about 5 of them, about 5% of them, so which means 75 units that have been suspended. We also show the suspension rate by country, as you could see here. And we noticed that the majority of the suspensions were located in emerging economies, such as Argentina and India, although there were also some suspensions that happened in high-income countries like Australia and Norway. And then we show the evolution of the status of these suspended power projects. So as you could see here, out of the 75 suspended projects, about 60% of them are suspended during the planning phase. So which means the constructions have not yet started. And then about 40% are suspended when after the constructions have started. And also most projects were firstly being delayed, and some of them evolved into cancellation later. And we also find that once the project is suspended, the chance of resuming a project is very low, as we only find about 7 units that have been suspended earlier were successfully operating in 2020. So these are their status evolution. And then we further show these investments by firm ownership and also by year. As you could see here, in the upper sub-figure, we see that Chinese firms invest in all kinds of technologies. As you could see here, hydropower has received the most number of power units of investments, followed by wind and solar. And fossil fuel projects have taken up 1/3 of all the investments. And Chinese firms also invest in a small range of less frequently used technologies, such as biomass, geothermal, and nuclear. And then in terms of firm ownership, we see that state-owned enterprise, so SOEs, are the main investors. And most of their investments are in hydro and also fossil fuel power plants. And provincial SOEs have a similar pattern as central SOEs, although the number of investments is much smaller compared to central SOEs. And then for private firms, they invest intensively in solar and geothermal technologies. And then we noticed that in terms of suspension rate, coal and hydro projects have the highest suspension rate, which are 17 and 9% respectively. Geothermal also has a high suspension rate, although the sample size is quite limited. So the fate of these suspended projects is quite variable, but there are still some apparent trends if we look at the investments and suspensions per year. So here, the red bars are showing the number of power projects that have been suspended in a particular year, and the other bar is showing the number of investments. So as you could see here, Chinese firms' overseas investments in power units have increased substantially after the launch of Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. And while some early project suspensions occurred in 2009, most of these suspensions occurred after 2015. And for coal projects in particular, they encountered a significant number of suspensions over the last 5 years, as you could see here. And similarly, there has been a sharp decline in the number of new hydropower projects since 2017. So these are some of the trends about Chinese overseas investments that we have observed. And then we compare these trends with other investors and also other regions. So here we show the trends for coal and hydropower, as we have noticed that these two technologies have the highest suspension rate. And in each sub-panel, so we firstly show the Chinese firms' overseas investments in 78 host countries here in the upper right figure, in the upper left figure. And then we show in the upper right figure that these are the non-Chinese firms' investments in the 78 host countries. And then in the lower left figure, we show the Chinese domestic investments. And then the last one is showing the so all the investments around the world for the global market. So we could see that if we focus on coal first, and we start with the global market, we can see that the number of global suspended coal projects surpassed the number of newly investment in 2015. It's also the year when the Paris Agreement was announced. And then the suspensions peaked in 2017 with more than 600 suspensions. And then over the next 3 years, the newly invested coal power projects have been dropping. Then if we take a closer look at the host countries market, we see that Chinese firms began to push overseas coal projects in 2013, while non-Chinese firms' investments in host countries have gradually decreased since 2014. And then if we compare Chinese domestic market with its overseas market, we see that when the Chinese domestic market has seen a surge in suspensions in 2016, the number of Chinese overseas markets, the number of Chinese overseas projects that have been suspended also reached a peak. So these are the trends for coal. And then for hydropower projects, we see that while Chinese overseas investments have increased from 2015 to 2017, during the same period, their domestic investments have decreased compared to earlier years. And then the number of hydro project suspensions at the global market have been increasing since 2010, and then the suspensions peaked in 2020 with more than 400 suspensions. And a similar trend is reflected in host countries' non-Chinese investments, with a peak of 370 suspensions in 2020. So all of these are some descriptive analysis of the trends of these power project suspensions. And since we noticed coal and hydro projects are more likely to be suspended, we further perform a survival analysis to test whether these suspensions really differ statistically significant among the different power generation technologies. So here, this table represents our results. As you can see here, from column 1 to 4, we gradually include the project level, firm level, and the country level control variables. And one thing to note here is, as I mentioned earlier, we report the hazard ratios here. So a hazard ratio greater than 1 suggests an increased risk of failure, while lower than 1 implies a decreased risk. So if we take column 4 as our baseline, as it includes all the control variables, we see that the results are consistent with our observations in the descriptive figures. So we find that coal and hydropower units are indeed more likely to be suspended than solar and wind projects. And the hazard rate is 3.8 and 8.2 times as high for coal and hydro projects, respectively, in comparison to other power generation technologies. And among the control variables, we do find that the likelihood of suspension is greater for projects with a larger capacity, financed by firms with less FDI experiences. So here FDI refers to foreign direct investment, and also located in countries with a greater degree of voice and accountability. So these are our findings on the power generation technology and the suspension risk. And we further test whether environmental issues are linked with the suspensions. So we identify the main environmental issues associated with these power projects from EJ Atlas, which is a database that documents and catalogs conflicts around environmental issues worldwide. So we find that the main environmental issues with coal projects are air pollution and climate change. And for hydro projects, the main concerns are their impacts on the local ecosystem. So here I only refer to the main environmental issues, as we all know that there are also other social or political issues with power projects, but they are not in our scope of analysis. So based on this, we developed 4 variables to reflect these environmental issues. Firstly, we use the population density surrounding coal projects to reflect the exposure of the surrounding population to the potential air pollution that may be released from coal plants. And then we use extreme weather events related fatalities to represent the perceived climate vulnerability in host countries. And thirdly, we use the hydro project's distance to protected areas as a proxy for the project's risks to ecosystems of high ecological importance and biodiversity values. And in addition to these 3 technology-specific measures, we also incorporate an environmental protest variable, which is a proxy for the activeness of the environmental movements in the local area. So here in the last column, I list all the sources of where these data are from. So here I show the results of our survival analysis to test whether power project suspensions are associated with these environmental risks. So we can see that for coal power projects, if we take column 4 as the baseline, we find that a 1 unit increase in the population density surrounding coal power project increases the hazard rate by 29% for coal units. And then we also find coal projects are more likely to be suspended when they are located in countries with higher climate-related fatalities. As here we see that a one day's increase per 100,000 inhabitants in host countries increases the hazard rate of coal projects by nearly 10 times. We also find that the coal projects in areas that have experienced recent environmental protests are more likely to be suspended than projects located in areas with no environmental protests, as the hazard ratio here is 4 times higher. And then in terms of hydro projects, we find a 1 kilometer increase in the distance from a nearby protected area reduces the hydropower project's hazard rate by 3%, as you could see here. However, we did not find any significant effect of local environmental protests on hydro project suspensions. And we believe, and we think one possible explanation for this might be that hydro projects tend to be located in remote areas where protests are likely to take place. And our place-based measure could only capture the environmental movements surrounding the power project. So this is just one possible explanation. I also look forward to see if you have any other thoughts on this. So all of these are our results. And just to conclude, by studying around 1,000 Chinese overseas investments in power units, we find that coal and hydro projects are more likely to be suspended than solar and wind projects. And project suspensions are associated with technology-specific, geo-referenced environmental risks. So we find that coal projects located in more densely populated areas in countries with more fatalities from extreme weather events are more likely to be suspended. And hydro projects located closer to protected areas tend to have a higher probability of being halted. And also coal projects located in areas with the presence of environmental protests have a higher chance of being abandoned. But we do not find such an effect on hydro projects. So these are the conclusions. And then we also present our limitations. So in this paper, we only focused on technology-specific environmental risks based on where the power projects are located. And we should realize that other risks may also affect the implementation. And also, more importantly, each project is situated in its unique technical, economic, social, and political context. So one needs to be cautious to interpret our findings as strict causality may not be established from our analysis. Okay, so finally, some implications. So our analysis show that investing in environmental risky projects is detrimental, even on the financial side. From our analysis, we see that environmental risks are not long-term risks that will take decades to be felt. They may actually translate risky projects into financial losses in a much shorter time, as the project can be canceled or delayed. So investors are strongly encouraged to take environmental risks into their decision-making process. And then the lessons from Chinese overseas investments also send a very clear message to all energy financiers. So as many of you know, here know, China has pledged to stop financing new coal power plants abroad in September 2021, which is a major step in combating climate change. According to a recent GDP Center policy brief, we find that Chinese public and commercial entities only found actually 13% of the operational and planned coal capacity outside China between 2013 and mid-2019. And also, according to an independent research earlier this year, a significant part of the international coal financiers are actually private investors, so including institutional investors and commercial banks. We know that now almost all the major public financiers have announced that they will cut funding for coal. So we urge that these private sectors could also join the public financiers in phasing out the funding for coal. And finally, some implications for host countries. So some previous research finds that Chinese investments tend to follow the demand of host countries, and host countries lack sufficient policies to steer these investments towards more environmentally friendly energies. So our study shows that solar and wind projects are actually having a lower chance of being suspended compared to coal and hydro projects. So this provides evidence that why host countries should foster more funding for renewables, because this is a way to achieve both financial and environmental success. So that's all from our paper, and thank you very much for your time for listening, and I look forward to having your comments and questions.
Thanks so much for a clear and concise presentation of the work of yourself and your co-authors. Those of you in the audience, it's now time to hear from you. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the Zoom, you will see a Q&A button. Please tell us your name and ask a question, and I can share those with Yangsiyu, and I think at least one of her co-authors is here as well. I'll start here with Nikolo Manic, excuse me if I pronounce your name wrong, says, great, thanks for the presentation. Could you quickly elaborate on the selection of variables? Why did you decide of these country variables in the first regressions and those environmental risk factors in the second? That's one question. I guess related, I'll ask one while we're waiting for other folks to fill in the Q&A button. On a lot of these studies that look at the different determinants of closure and so forth, other social scientists are concerned with things such as, is there a relative degree of corruption in the country? Some of those kinds of, is it relatively more democratic? They put these polity scores and so forth. Did you consider those kind of strategies to try to control for some of the other things that have been seen as putting a drag on different projects? And a related question, I guess, would be, to what extent do you think is China unique? Would a second stage of this project be to compare the extent to which Chinese coal and hydro power plants are relatively more, if the risks are such that it causes more cancellations than, say, Japan, which also finances a lot of coal and a lot of hydro. Let's see if that little filibuster got us another question yet. Not yet. So why don't you answer those two? And please, folks, really interesting work in progress here. We welcome your questions.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you for the questions first. So I'll answer Nicolo's question first. So in terms of the control variables at the country level, so if you remember from the slide, I include GDP per capita, access to electricity, and voice and accountability. These three variables as the country level control variables. So I think why we use GDP, well, it's like GDP could control for the development level of different countries. And we know that this could actually controls for many things like well-being, the government's level, and a lot of things. So that's why we include the GDP per capita. And then in terms of access to electricity, so since we study electric power projects, and we think the having access to electricity is one of the priorities for host countries. So that's why we include this variable, thinking it may be an important control variable. And then the last one on voice and accountability. So that is a variable we collected from the World Governance Indicators. So for this one, it's because since we see that public voices may also play a role in the project implementation. So that's why we would like to include this variable to reflect the government's level in host countries in this sense. So I hope this answers the first question. And then in terms of the environmental risk factors, so as I showed during the slides, so these risk factors are the main environmental issues that we identified from the EJ Atlas database, which documents the world conflicts on environmental issues. And we find for coal, the issues are usually, the environmental issues are usually related to to air pollution and climate change. Then for hydro, it's related to the ecosystem impacts. So that's why we developed these variables to represent the environmental risks. Okay, so I think this answers Nicola's question. And then in response to Kevin's question, so yeah, I do agree that besides these environmental issues, there are also a lot of other factors. As you mentioned, like the corruption level or any other political issues that may also influence the implementation of these projects. So in this paper, we do not cover these risk variables, but there might be something for us to further explore. And then in terms of like the future research plans, so actually, we do think that we can extend this to a wider range of power project investments. And you are right that we could later on do a more like a comparison study of like how the Chinese investments differ from non-Chinese investments. And also, I think there are also like many other questions, very interesting questions that we can explore in the next stage. So I hope this answers these two questions.
Great, thanks so much. And that's all it took to fill up the Q&A box in insightful responses. So let me go to a couple others here. We have one from Bowen Gu. Bowen Gu is from the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice team. Says, thanks for a great and detailed presentation. It's interesting to see that you referred to the EJ Atlas for the environmental claims concerning power projects. Could you further explain how you use the EJ Atlas? For example, did you filter and analyze all the coal and hydro projects in the EJ Atlas maps? Thank you. Second one is from May Fareed. She's a visiting scholar at Stanford University. Also says, thanks for a great presentation. She's curious about what has been observed with respect to the role of host country social actors, such as environmental organizations, business leaders, and community leaders, et cetera, in promoting or opposing new or ongoing projects. How do they interact with the Chinese actors, especially given that many of these are state-owned enterprises? And what mechanisms do state-owned enterprises use to interact directly with these actors, or are these interactions mostly indirect? Let me ask one other. Scott Vaughn, thanks for joining us, Scott, from the China Council on International Cooperation on Environment and Development, says thanks for the excellent work. He has a clarifying question. Are private financiers of international projects known? I'm not sure if you're talking about Chinese specifically or not, but I think that's a clarification question on you for your data set there. And we have one from Rebecca Ray, senior researcher here on team, says, what policy recommendations arise from this work in light of China's new commitment to end coal finance overseas and boost renewables? Are there still lessons for China and borrowing countries? We have a couple others, but I'll get those in another round.
Thanks, Kevin. So first, on Bowen's question, yeah, so hi, Bowen. It's really nice to see that you are representing the EJ Atlas team here. And also, like, many thanks for coming to this presentation. So in terms of how I used your database, so I looked through the publication you had in environmental research letters. I don't know if you are aware of this publication, but it's a publication by Temper al. In 2020 in environmental research letters, which summarized all the environmental issues related to all energy projects. So I extract the information based on what that literature says. And we also look through some detailed case studies by identifying some of the Chinese firms involved energy projects that are documented in EJ Atlas. So I hope this answers your question. And then a second question from May. So I think which is concerned on like how the role of host country social actors, like environmental organizations, community leaders, how they are reflected with this analysis. So I would say, firstly, if you notice the environmental protest variable we included in our analysis, so that variable actually is extracted from Google's, I can't remember the full name of it, but it's Google's global media event database, so which records all the protests events from around 100 languages in the world. So in that protest variable, actually, it reflects to many environmental movements that were organized by these environmental organizations or community leaders. So I would say it's like that is how this part of question is addressed in our analysis. And we have not yet explored any other interactions with SOEs or something beyond this part. And I think this may be some further research for us. So thanks for raising this. And then a third question, I think is from Scott's question. So on private financiers. So he asked, are private financiers of international coal projects known? For this, I recommend you to look to the literature I mentioned during my presentation. which is a report earlier this year from a German NGO that examines the private financiers in international coal projects. If I remember correctly, they indeed list some of these private financiers. Usually they are commercial banks from Japan and also from the Western world. But in order to have a detailed list of the investors, you may need to refer to that literature. And a last question from Rebecca. So in terms of policy recommendations, so it's like, are there any lessons for China and borrowing countries in terms of how could they, in terms of China's new commitment to end coal finance? So I think for this, one of the major policy recommendations is that we know that there are still a large number of projects that are under development. So I think one thing is like these projects may be under risk of suspension. So we need to come up with solutions to see how could we move this transfer from coal project to renewables more smoothly without causing more stranded assets. And another thing which I think is very important from this paper is that we indeed find that investing in renewable projects, in solar and wind projects, has a lower chance of being suspended than investing in coal and hydro projects. And especially now, since China has announced to stop coal financing, so we would like, think that since hydro project is also highly risky, it would be better to move this kind of finance towards less risky solar and wind projects, since China is no longer funding more new coal projects. So I hope this answers the set of questions.
Thanks so much, Yangsiyu. Just to add to that hydro note, some of the work of Becky Ray, one of the people that asked one of these questions, and others have shown that that many of these hydroelectric power projects that are in the close proximity of these biodiverse areas in one of your variables, those projects have significant climate risks. Most of the studies show that they're around the same level of supercritical coal or sort of older, dirtier gas plants, and so they're significant climate emitters as well. I think we have a question from Yan Wang, a senior economist here at the GDP Center. She says, very interesting research. Did you consider the level of endowment of each host country? Rich and cheap coal reserves in these host countries. Suspension of coal-fired power plants may need the host country to have to go against their comparative advantage. I think to try to clarify this a little bit, I think the question is, well, if coal is a more of a centerpiece of a country's economy, therefore it's they have more of a comparative advantage in coal. Whereas in some countries, it might be, there might be 2 or 3 power plants. Did you control, or had you, how might you think about the utility of controlling for the extent to which coal is more of a core part of a country's economic activity? I think that's a different way to phrase what Yang Wang said, not to put words in her mouth.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So, and also thanks, Dr. Wang Yan, for your question. So in this research, we did not consider the level of endowment of each host country. Although I know there is a large amount of literature that tries to understand the natural resource endowment of different types of power generations. So I know there have been research that studies the coal reserves, the gas reserves, as well as they study the solar potential, the wind potential, and so forth. So I think that is indeed something important for us to understand. And we indeed need to need more research to understand like the endowment of each country. And with this said, I think for the so in terms of the question on if a country has a lot of coal reserves, then we then we do not encourage them to build coal plants. So I think in order to tackle these, there have been some examples that in countries, sometimes even they do not have coal reserves, if there is policy push or for some other reasons, they want to build a coal plant, then they even import coal from other countries in order to have a coal plant in their own country. So I'm talking about this referring to, if I remember correctly, a case that happened in Kenya. So where they try to build coal power plant with imported coal. So I think this kind of examples show that in terms of the technology choice, sometimes the endowment of resources is playing a less important role than the policy push or like any other supports. So I think in order to tackle these, we should realize the importance of the policy directions, and also how could we have more public policies? How could we set our guidelines in order to encourage more financing towards those clean energies? So I think that may be the right way to move forward.
Thanks so much. There's a couple more here. I was just about to close it out, but let me give you two more. If you can answer them quickly and make a closing remark, make sure you give me a second to invite everyone back to the next one. Samuel Law says, I wonder if your research and database will be publicly available, question mark. The International Hydropower Association would be interested to investigate why hydro projects are more likely to be suspended. However, I'd like to note that hydropower and wind and solar have different roles and functions in the power system, as wind and solar are intermittent energy sources, whereas hydro can be used as a balancing power to stabilize the power grid. And then Nicolo Manch says, did you consider extending your work to the future, i.e. predicting which plants might be suspended on the identified variables? So if you can address those quickly, and then make any closing remark and allow me to thank everyone for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So for the first question, so for the database, in terms of Chinese overseas investments, so here at the GDP Center, you could refer to our Global China Power database, which is totally open to public. And that includes a lot of information on Chinese overseas investments in power units. And then for the power unit data site, you could also refer to the sources that I mentioned. So I use 3 sources. 2 of them are publicly available. You could refer to that. And then in terms of whether the different technologies may have different roles, yes, that is indeed true. And so what we are showing in this paper is just that hydro projects are more likely to be suspended. But then in terms of whether the host country will decide to build a hydro dam or not, So that will depend on a lot of other factors, including like the technical, economic, and social factors. So that is not covered in this analysis. And then lastly, to Nicholas' question. So for now, we do not have any plans to have a model to predict which plans might be suspended based on the variables we have for now.
Well, thanks so much for this great research. Folks, this video and PowerPoint will be posted on the GDP Center's YouTube page. And I want to invite everyone to come back on December 15th for Austin Strange. He's an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong. His paper or his presentation will be about his forthcoming book, Banking on Beijing, the Aims and Impacts of Chinese Overseas Development. And I would be remiss not to ask folks to go into the chat here and learn more about our Global China Fellows program. Yangsiyu is one of our exciting Global China Fellows, and we're actually recruiting new fellows for the next academic year, either pre-doctoral fellows, students in universities around the world, doesn't matter where you're from, or postdoctoral fellows, folks who have just graduated and are looking to come to the GDP Center for a semester or a year to further engage in their own research on China's overseas development finance and work on a variety of techniques and action that we do here on policy-oriented research. Thanks everyone for coming today, and we'll see you all on December 15th. And thank you again, Yangsiyu.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everyone.